And I want to just talk a little bit about the big issue related to negative externalities that we have been talking about in the public policy sphere, and that's global climate change. But I do want to highlight a couple of things of what our analysis of externalities have to say about global climate change. Okay, so the first bullet point here. First of all, fossil fuel usage, which creates carbon dioxide and is emitted into the atmosphere, causes climate change, and that can have a negative impact upon the human population. That's the science that we know about, okay? And that's what's being, to some degree, disputed, as some people claim that climate change is not real or it's not caused by humans. I'm going to ignore that issue and just say it's accepted fact that fossil fuel usage is causing climate change, and that's going to have some sort of negative impact upon the human population in the future. Next, though, comes what do we do about that? And what are the economics of that particular issue? Well, the first thing to point out is that fossil fuel usage is clearly is creating a negative externality effect. And it's coming about from both production, production of electricity using coal or using oil or using gas is emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, no doubt about it. And consumption of gasoline and electricity and even battery usage, because the batteries need electricity, which has to come from power plants, which are often generated by carbon-based fuels, and thus is causing emissions into the atmosphere and is resulting in global climate change. Okay, now we can correct for that with an optimal tax or a quota on fossil fuel usage. That's what our principles tell us. But here's the problem. It's really complicated. Because in order to do it, and to do it right, you got to get the numbers right. And got to know exactly how much benefit we're getting from the use of fossil fuel and weigh that against the cost of reducing that. So let me talk a little bit about benefits and costs and how we would measure them. So FF for fossil fuels. What are the benefits of fossil fuel usage? Well, I mean, it's providing the majority of our energy usage today, right? Including electricity, transportation, heating, production, electronics, everything. A lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis is being generated because of our use of energy. And the most efficient way we have discovered up until now, and this might be changing a little bit, has been to use fossil fuels and burn it in order to produce energy. And so we've got power plants run on fossil fuels, and we've got automobiles run on fossil fuels, and on and on and on. Now, in the 1970s, the big debate was when we were going to run out of fossil fuels, that these were going to be, because they're non-renewable, we're digging them up out of the earth, or they're going to disappear. And then what do we do about that? Well, what's happened in the last 50 years or so, since the 1970s, is that we actually have more fossil fuels that we've discovered and know are available under the earth than we've ever had before. They figured out more ways to figure out how to take shale oil and turn it into useful oil and into gas. They figured out how to find oil in unsuspecting places all around the globe. So that I would bet you, I'm not sure about this entirely, but I'll bet you that there's more fossil fuels available today than there's ever been before. And that's stretching long into the future. So fossil fuels are available. They could probably sustain us if we continued in our same activities for the next 200 or 300 years, and maybe more. There's just a lot of fossil fuels out there. There are a lot of companies and countries that control reserves. They know this stuff is under the ground, they know where it is, and they know that if it's dug out and we continue going as usual, that they're going to be able to profit enormously from the sale and usage of those things. Now, I just want to highlight one of my sort of pet peeves is that there's a lot of concern about the production of fossil fuels, and there's a lot of anger at the companies who are producing these fossil fuels, which I think is kind of misdirected. I mean, production of fossil fuels is happening not because there's some evil producers that have decided they want to ruin the earth. It's really because consumers across the world, they want to travel places, they want to go, they want to get in their cars, they want to have their electronics, everybody demands electricity and energy at such a high level today that producers are there to provide it for them. So it's improper, I think, to kind of target producers and say they're at fault. Now, they might be at fault for some other things, but just producing it is not a detriment in itself. And it's one of these things where they're producing something that generates benefits for consumers. Everybody is benefiting from the current system. But now we have to really engage and think about how are we going to solve this climate change process and how can we work together in order to do that. And I just think that if we demonize the fossil fuel industry and say they're evil, that is a good path to not get any cooperation between groups who are going to be very important in solving this particular problem. And I'll start out by just mentioning or highlighting that I don't have an answer to this. And economics as a profession doesn't have an answer to how to solve the problem of global climate change. But it is an economic problem, and it's got a lot of complex elements to it, some of which relate to some of the issues that we have talked about in this class. So I want to highlight that relationship to the issues we've discussed without really being able to offer you a clear path or a clear idea of how we find the solution. Okay, so just a quick reminder of what the issue is. Fossil fuel usage causes climate change, which has a potentially negative effect upon the human population. So we can think of that as a negative externality effect. And it's an effect that takes place because production of certain things creates carbon that gets emitted to the atmosphere, and consumption of things causes carbon emissions as well. Now, the simple response to that is we can correct for the overproduction and overconsumption of fossil fuels with an appropriate tax or quota on fossil fuel usage. But it's not really as simple as that. And even if we think about, well, what would be the right tax, what would be the right response, how much reduction in fossil fuel usage should we have, the problem is extremely complicated. And I just want to highlight some of those complications here. So first, in economics, we're inclined to say, well, let's try to think about first how to characterize, and then secondarily how to measure the costs and benefits of the activity that we're trying to study or understand. So we could ask, well, what are the benefits of fossil fuel usage? And they are widespread. They provide for our energy usage in a big way. They provide electricity, transportation, heating, and so forth and so on. And there's a great abundance of fossil fuels that are currently available under the ground, can be tapped, and we found more than was ever expected 50 years ago to be able to be used. So it's a relatively reliable and cheap energy source that we have created an infrastructure, internal combustion engines in automobiles, for example, that relies on that particular resource. And so we have built an economy that's based on non-renewable fossil fuel resources. And that's sort of the situation that we find ourselves in. It's creating a lot of benefits. It's created the industrial economy that we have today. And it's just generated an awful lot of well-being for people around the world because of the energy usage that we have today. But it creates this negative externality effect now that we have to be conscious of and consider. So let's go on. What are the costs of fossil fuel usage? So the costs are, the larger damage-causing storms that are likely to arise, the rising sea levels, coastal flooding, more droughts causing fires and reducing agricultural production, and so forth. It's just a small list of some of the damages to our economic production systems and our living systems that are likely to be affected as a result of climate change in the future. Next question is, when do these costs likely to appear? And here I want to highlight that one of the problems with this problem itself is that most of the costs are in the future. There's a lot of discussion today where, we look at the forest fires in California and people have said, oh, well, that's a direct result of climate change. It's evidence of that. But really, I want to highlight the fact that those forest fires cannot be evidence of global climate change in and of themselves, nor can things like, the large number of hurricanes that we had this particular season. People will say, oh, look at all the hurricanes we've had. That's a result of climate change. But really, we can't attribute individual events or even a 5-year cycle or 10-year cycle of events. We can't really attribute that to climate change because there's no way for us to be sure, for example, that this large number of hurricanes this season might not be very similar to what happened, say, in the year 1322, for example. And maybe in 427, there was a period of 10 years where the hurricanes were really, really intense that came through this area. We don't have that information, and it's quite possible that the current event is just an aftermath of these same patterns that could have some very severe years and some years where things are not so severe. So it doesn't mean that it can't be being caused by that, but the events themselves are not really justification for that. I want to highlight the fact that no one person can really experience the effects of global climate change, because global climate change is something that's been recognized because of looking at long patterns of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, looking at long patterns of storms and other sorts of weather events. And you have to look at the patterns over 50 years, 100 years, or even more in order to get a sense of whether the climate is really affecting these particular things. And when you look at the data that way, you can see it, but you have to look at the data. You have to look at this long period of time. And no one person is experiencing life over 100 years. They're not experiencing the forest fires over 500 years to know whether they're more serious now than they were before. So the point I want to make is that you have to accept science, what the science is telling us, in order to have a belief that climate change is real. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are still willing to say, I don't believe it. I don't think it's there. And that's because they themselves can't experience it. They can't be sure. You have to put your trust in science in order for that to be valid. Now, we could ask the next question. Who is going to experience the cost of fossil fuel usage as suggested by the science today? And the answer is really, again, most of us today are not really experiencing the effects of climate change, but it's people living 50, 100, 150, or 200 years from now. They're going to experience the brunt of the effects if we could keep going, and that's what the science is telling us. It's going to be people in coastal communities that are affected by sea level changes. It's going to be people in hurricane, typhoon, cyclone prone areas that might experience the greater storms. It's going to be people more in developing countries, they say, that are more likely to suffer the negative effects of climate change than people in developed markets or countries like the United States. So the distribution of who's going to be affected, again, is not really in the here and now, and it's also not really in the United States or in the developed economies themselves. It's going to be people elsewhere that are going to be most affected as a result of this. And then economically, we'd like to say, well, can we measure these costs? Do we know how big the effects are going to be? Here, the answer is we make attempts at measuring those, but they're not at all reliable. I mean, we're looking far into the future. We're using projection models that are based on lots of assumptions, tweak the assumptions just a little bit. We get very different results that can come out in the future. It's an exercise that needs to be done, but we shouldn't put a lot of faith in our ability to actually measure how big the costs of climate change are going to be for different peoples in society in the future. There's just too much complexity, and the effects just stretch too far in the future. All right, now, I want to highlight a couple of things about this problem. The issue is a collective action problem. Okay, we talked about how individuals get together to lobby for their special interests and how they can more effectively get together if they share common values, if they have a small group rather than a large group, if the effects are concentrated and people know about them and feel them, that can help solve the collective action problem. But here, the collective action problem is international. Every country's carbon emissions are affecting the entire world's climate and the outcome of that. Free riding, we talked about that, is a real problem here because individual countries can decide to say, well, you know, it's not really my problem. I'm not going to participate in this effort. It's going to have too big of an effect upon us. Let other people solve the problem. I don't really feel the effect. I don't think it's going to affect our country. And so trying to get people together to form like these international climate change agreements is really, really difficult. And even when we've done it, if you go back to the previous climate agreements that have been made, you know, countries say, okay, we'll do these things, but then we find that the countries don't really do what they've promised to do because they have a hard time convincing their own citizens to make changes, to make these actions real, to make it a realistic possibility. So free riding, even if a country agrees to participate in a climate change agreement, doesn't mean they're actually going to follow through and do the things that they've promised 5 years, 10 years down the road. Some countries' efforts may cause more short-term harm. By this, I'm meaning developing countries especially have this problem associated with, they want to stimulate economic development. They want to raise their peoples up out of poverty. The simplest, easy way to do that is to use energy derived from our known sources, which is fossil fuels. The more difficult way to do that is to use alternative energy sources, or to maybe cut back on the use of fossil fuels, but that might mean cutting back on the promotion of their economic development and growth. So developing economies have to try to figure this out. How do we balance these particular things? And developed countries, well, here we're asking developed countries to make changes to the way they produce and consume, and the benefit is not likely to even accrue to the people in the developed economies if the effects of climate change are going to be mostly weighted towards developing economies in the rest of the world. So you're asking people to make changes to their behavior in the US so as to help people in India and in the South Pacific Islands and things like that 10 years, 25 years, 50 years in the future. It's a hard sell. It's difficult to get people to jump on board for an activity like that. One issue that rises up all the time is who's responsible for the climate change that's here and who should be responsible for making the big changes going forward. And a lot of times people look at the biggest emitters, of which China is the single biggest emitter today. But if you look historically, we should recognize that climate change occurs because of the sum total of carbon that's been emitted since the beginning of the industrial age. And if we ask the question that way, then China, for example, points to the US and says, well, you're the ones who emitted most of the emissions into the atmosphere already, so you should be the ones that have to make the big changes today, not China, which is still a developing economy in terms of their per capita income. Okay, so that's another issue. How do we kind of share the costs associated with making these particular adjustments? And then how do we determine the optimal solution? That's what economists would tend to think. How do we figure out how we balance these costs and benefits over a long period of time? What are the costs of various options? How much would it cost to reduce fossil fuel usage? How much reduction is absolutely necessary? What about an alternative? What if we said, well, forget about it. We'll just keep using fossil fuels, but we'll adapt to the consequences. We'll move cities inland a little bit. We'll prepare ourselves for bigger hurricanes. We'll use science to try to adjust where we grow our crops so that we can simply live with the new climate that is coming about. That's an alternative way to, quote unquote, solve the problem. Another way to solve the problem would be to geoengineer a decrease in global temperatures. Maybe we can conceive of some sort of carbon sucking up machines that would just take carbon out of the atmosphere. Or we can grow more forests that will sop up the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Or we can introduce crystals into the atmosphere that reflect sunlight so as to lower the temperature of how much would that cost? Would that be a beneficial way to go about it? What about alternative non-carbon energy sources like wind and solar and stuff? How much will that cost relative to the benefits that can come about for it? And how long will all of these options take? I don't have answers to these, but I do want to highlight that when we look at these different ways in which we can respond to the climate change problem, it's not as simple as just saying science tells us the climate is changing, and a lot of people will then make the next jump and say, therefore, we have to cut back on carbon usage. We have to put a big tax on gasoline usage, for example. That's what the science tells us. Well, I want to correct that. The science doesn't tell us what the economic answer is or the solution is. The science tells us that the temperature of the globe is changing and that's going to affect weather conditions and ocean levels and things like that. The economics of the problem is much more complicated because it involves determining the costs and benefits of various types of actions. And if we want to think about this completely, we should be considering all of these different options and trying to weigh the cost and benefits of all of them against each other. Not just saying, oh, it's clear what our answer should be. We should just reduce oil and gas usage dramatically next year, and that's the only way out of the problem. It's not the only way out of the problem. There's lots of other ways out of the problem as well. And we ought to be considering all of them because this is a very complicated and a very serious problem to consider. Last thing I want to highlight is, First of all, global climate change is a global externality problem, a negative externality. And so it's got this economic characteristic to it that we've studied in this particular class. It's got another characteristic to it in that it's a collective action problem. Just talked about that a few seconds ago. It's like being stuck in a prisoner's dilemma problem, which we talked about earlier in the course, because each individual actor and country sort of has their own best interest in mind when they just ignore the problem and free ride on the collective action issue. So everybody, if left to their own devices, is sort of going to be inclined to not act, to not do anything about this particular problem, because it's in their individual best interest to do that. But we could well be in a situation then where if everybody does what's in their best interest, we end up with a terrible outcome for everybody, because it would really be best if everyone sort of collectively acted and made a particular change in order to reach a particular solution. Okay, so there is a prisoner's dilemma aspect to this particular problem. Global climate change poses an absolutely severe measurement problem. It's just we ought to take everything that's said about climate change, the economic effects, with a grain of salt. We should recognize these are estimates. Those estimates are likely to change over time as we get better or worse at calculating these things. And we're going to be making decisions about things under great uncertainty. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't act, but it means that we have to be aware of the fact that we're going to have to adjust course potentially many times along the way, if we can even get started on the changes that are necessary to address this particular problem. And then mentioned this earlier. So the science of climate change may be known, but the economics of climate change is just far from being known. And we should recognize that distinction between the two in order to have a better chance of addressing this particular problem.